Hello and welcome to a wee presentation with the Living Memory Association. The month of August is the time when more people move houses than in any other month of the year. So today, through photographs and memories from our online and museum visitors, we will be remembering what it was like to move en masse into not just a new home, but a whole new neighborhood of freshly built, prefabricated houses. Near the end of the war, in March 1944, Prime Minister Winston Churchill promised to build 500,000 temporary new homes to deal with the housing shortage. In all, 156,000 temporary prefabricated bungalows were produced in Britain between 1945 and 1949. And over 32,000 of these were in Scotland, where councils continued to build them as late as 1966, according to the Scotland newspaper. These homes were only expected to last about 10 years and then be replaced with permanent housing. Although the majority of prefabs were demolished, a few thousand have survived and people are still living in them over 70 years later. It was said that 12 semi-skilled men could put up a prefab house in an hour, and the material was never packed to wider than 2.3 meters so they could be transported by road. The walls and roof were typically made of metal, and the floor was wood. It was like being in a caravan. You used to hear the water hitting off the roof, one resident remembered. Some prefabs, like those in the photo here, had flat roofs, which was unusual for architectural styles in that time. And some had wraparound corner windows that allowed the living room to enjoy as much light as possible. Heather Scobie remembers that those at the Southampton Mains neighborhood had metal roofs. She says, "They were always cream-colored like a wee house that had been built with pop rivets all bolted together. The ones in East Calder Waverley Terrace have modernized, and they have had tiled roofs and concrete panels put up the side of the walls, and of course double-glazed windows." Doug Bellum sent us this floor plan for an early prefab house. Doug did not live in a prefab himself, but he remembers visiting. He says, my grandparents lived at 13 Pennywell Path. I was there very regularly. The prefabs were all kitted out with a fitted kitchen and included a gas fridge. As you can see in the plan, the kitchen and the bathroom came in one piece, with a wall in between, which contained the piping for both rooms. The fitted kitchen came with a refrigerator, cooker, and water boiler for washing clothes. And there was an indoor bathroom with a heated towel rail, a luxury in those days, a toilet, fitted cupboards, and a back boiler, which provided constant hot water. Rents were affordable, and the built-in cupboards and appliances meant that new tenants didn't have to spend money on them. And the large gardens also enabled them to grow vegetables and fruit while rationing was still in force. And we have many memories of the gardens, which we'll share with you later. Prefabs were prioritized for returning service personnel and their families, key workers, people who had been bombed out of their homes, and those who were living in overcrowded conditions. Young families would have the opportunity to live in a brand new detached house, and there were also extended families living together or near one another, as this photo shows. Prefabs were often used as what we would now call a starter home until the family grew bigger. As Fiona Mora Graham remembers, she says, "My parents and 3 of my older siblings moved to a prefab at Sighthill after the war. They then moved to the new houses, which were built at Clermiston, where both myself and my little sister were born." This is a photo of the inside of what would be one of our visitors, Willie Wallace's, boyhood home in Sighthill. Willie remembers, "There was one street of houses in Sighthill where they built 5 different housing types to see which used the ground best and which would house most people. Well, our prefab was the first one built in Scotland on that street. We have a picture of the housing minister sitting in the living room. It had a coke stove in the kitchen which heated the water. My parents bought a 3-bar electric fire for the living room. The walls ran with condensation in the spring and autumn, and that froze during the winter. That said, we were luckier than most families, with a 3-bedroom detached house and an inside bathroom with its own garden. As Monty Python said, luxury! People liked the prefab houses straight away, as well as the lifestyle they created. Families were from the same background and of similar ages. Those who lived in the prefabs were called a good community spirit. People often have very happy memories of family life in the prefabs. This photo of an al fresco afternoon tea shows members of the Rington Fiddler family in 1946 in the garden of their prefab home at Oxgangs, Colinton. Lizzie is holding the tea tray with Billy on the far right, Dolly at the front, Billy Nelson to her right, Isa, Jessie and Chrissy with Charlie sitting on the swing. Irene McCluckey, whose parents are in this photo, remembers living in this house until 1962 when they moved to the Inch area. The corrugated structure behind the group had probably been an Anderson air shelter, built for air raids, and after the war ended, many of these served as coal sheds or garden sheds. And here are 2 more contented outdoorsy types. This photo is from Jean Bell. Many residents of the new prefab houses across Britain had lived in big cities which had been heavily bombed, and they were used to living in shared flats or houses with toilets outside and no hot water. So for many, this was the first time they had a garden of their own. Jean remembers, this photo was taken at my Aunt Alice's prefab house at Sighthill after she moved from Lawnmarket. Her dog was named Jet. Behind Jean and Jet is another Anderson air raid shelter, which many of you have commented on. Eunice Thompson remembers, prefabs had these shelters as storage, different from Anderson shelters. They were partially buried. Some people put soil and grew vegetables on the top. These 2 very lovely photos show young Hamish Jones in the back garden of his parents' prefab house in the late 1950s. Both photos also show his wee pal, Sheena, the dog, and the little girl is Hamish and Sheena's neighborhood friend, Joyce Smart. Again, many of those who lived in the prefab neighborhoods outside Edinburgh remember the gardens fondly, and so many of you have commented on the converted Anderson shelters. Doug remembers these 2 and says, my granddad was a great gardener, and the front and back gardens were beautiful. There was an old corrugated shed in the garden that had been an old air raid shelter. Willie Wallace also remembers these. He said, the houses in Sighthill had shelters, and there were very few left by the time I was growing up, because we roamed the back gardens looking for apple trees, and we knew who had them and who didn't. They were all dug into the ground and earthed and grassed over. There wasn't one in our garden, only a suspicious hollow under some overhanging willows my dad had planted, which looked like where the shelter may have been at one time. Since priority for moving into the prefabs when they were first built was given to families with young children, most people were from the same generation, with working class backgrounds and raising young children. This photo shows 3 young mothers living in Oxgangs prefab neighborhood. One of them is Bridget Jones, whose son Hamish was in the earlier photo with his wee dog Sheena. The Oxgangs gang are the stars of this lovely photo, taken in 1951. In the back row are Gladys McLean, Douglas Kent, Maureen Jones and David Jones, and in the front row are Ian Alvis and Kathleen Jones. The children are standing in the garden of a prefab home at Oxgangs Grove. The fields in the background were owned and farmed by the Harwells. This cheery wee gang look as though they haven't a care in the world. In this photograph, we are at the Pennywell prefabs in 1959. Gordon Munro is the baby in his granny's arms in the back garden, and with his 2 cousins standing beside her. Families often lived close to each other, with grannies playing a central role in family life. Of course, many of our Leith residents will know Gordon Munro as Scottish Labour's Edinburgh Councillor for Leith. The smart-looking young people in this photo are Evelyn Mobbs, her sister, and a friend standing in front of their home in the late 1970s. Like many of our visitors remember, the council has now pulled down this house, though Evelyn remembers it fondly. As you can see, a sort of post-war house of a prefab nature with a flat roof. We were the upstairs flat, 3 bedrooms, kitchen, and living room, coal house, and coat cupboard in hallway, through glass door at top of stone stairs. The main door was at the side. The group is standing in the drying green. Further up was a huge stretch of land, good for football and so on. A hedge divided our garden from the downstairs garden. The house is no longer there. The council pulled them down. We had a great view over the Forth to the front. However, living in a prefab wasn't all perfect. Toilets sometimes flushed with hot water, and the houses were vulnerable to storm damage, with leaking roofs also common. Several of our visitors remember heavy condensation on the windows, which often froze over in the winter. As this photo from the Scotsman shows, the houses also struggled to stand against the strong Scottish weather, and the roofs sometimes disappeared in the high wind. Doug Bellum remembers, the only problem living there was that the houses were prone to condensation, and they also had asbestos tiles on the roof. I remember a prefab a few doors down from us caught fire. The roof tiles were exploding off. It burned down pretty quickly. I don't recall anyone being killed, thankfully. Most of the prefab houses built in Edinburgh have since been demolished by the council. In this photo from the Scotsman, a woman polishes her window in front of her neighbours' homes in Sighthill, which have been demolished. This was from the early 1960s, when around half of all prefab houses built in Scotland were torn down. Some of our visitors remember this. Jean Imrie wrote to say that, I loved my prefab house in Lonehead, and we lived there from 1955 until 1968, when they were demolished. Jan Fairburn says, I love the prefab that we lived in for 12 years until I was 16, and then it was demolished. I have fond memories of our time in our prefab, apart from the ice inside the windows in the winter. Although the height of prefab living was in the decades just after the war, prefabs are still popular and are useful for community projects, both here and around the world. One project is very near some of the old prefab neighbourhoods. The Social Bite Village is a residential neighbourhood in Granton, Edinburgh, which was built to support Edinburgh's residents affected by homelessness. The purpose of the village is to offer the right support, living environment, and opportunities for someone to build an independent life. The village is made up of 10 nest houses, or prefab houses, and each is shared by 2 residents, plus an additional unit for staff. There's a large central community hub, which is the focus of community life. Just like the post-war prefab neighborhoods, the Social Bite prefabs are part of a close-knit community. There's an active weekly timetable, including opportunities from yoga, daily mile, and bike rides, to cooking and DJ sessions. Resident community members usually live at the village between a year and a half. Over this time, people contribute to the life of the community, learn a range of new skills, and engage in work and voluntary placements. We leave you with a photo of a cozy sleeping area inside the Social Bite village housing. With over 130,000 prefab homes built in Scotland, there must be many more memories and photos. Please get in touch to share them with us. We would especially like to hear from anyone who is still living in one of the original prefab houses near Edinburgh. Do your windows still freeze over in the cold? Do your neighbours wonder at how well you have looked after your prefab? We would love to hear your memories. Don't forget, our wee Museum of Memory at Ocean Terminal Leith is now open, so please do stop by for a visit soon.